They claimed his land wasn't his. When Tom Wilson found a sign declaring part of his backyard as public access maintained by HOA, he was stunned. His property had never been part of their jurisdiction. But HOA President Karen Roberts smugly dismissed him. "Your land belongs to the community now." Within days, benches and trash bins appeared on his lawn, strangers trampled his garden, and Karen issued him bogus fines, daring him to fight back. What she didn't realize was that Tom had the evidence and resolve to expose her lies, and by the time he was done, Karen would wish she'd never crossed him. But let's start at the beginning. Tom Wilson's home wasn't just a house. It was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifices, and dreams. Tucked at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, it offered an oasis of peace. His backyard was where his two children, Lily and Ben, spent countless afternoons playing tag, their laughter echoing against the tall oak trees. His wife, Emily, often retreated there to read her favorite novels, sipping coffee on the patio as the morning sunlight streamed through the leaves. This was their sanctuary, untouched and wholly their own, until the day it wasn't. The trouble began on what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday. Tom pulled into his driveway after a long day at the engineering firm, his mind preoccupied with a project deadline. As he parked, something unusual caught his eye. Just beyond the edge of his front lawn, where his meticulously trimmed grass met the road, stood a newly installed wooden post with a shiny metal sign bolted to it. Tom frowned, stepping out of his car for a closer look. The bold black letters against the reflective surface read, "Public Access Pathway, maintained by HOA." His initial reaction was confusion. Public access? Pathway? This was his land, private land. Tom glanced around, half expecting to see someone from the HOA lingering nearby, perhaps to explain the sudden appearance of this sign. But the street was quiet, the only sound coming from the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Tom's confusion quickly turned into unease. He crouched down to inspect the post. It was driven deep into the ground, bolted with precision, as if it had been there for years. He ran his hand over the metal sign, the smoothness of its surface starkly contrasting with the rough bark of the wooden post. "What is this supposed to mean?" Tom muttered to himself. Dinner that evening was subdued. Emily noticed her husband's furrowed brow and restless tapping fingers against the table. She reached out, placing her hand on his. "What's wrong?" Tom exhaled sharply, setting his fork down. "There's a sign on the edge of our property. It says the HOA has made it a public access pathway." Emily's brow knit in confusion. "That doesn't make sense. We're not even part of the HOA." "Exactly," Tom replied. "But apparently, that doesn't matter to them. I called their office and guess who answered?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Karen Roberts. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. As president of the HOA, she wielded her position like a scepter, issuing fines and decrees that left residents grumbling behind closed doors. But since the Wilsons' property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, they'd largely been spared her antics. Until now. She said our land has been included in their jurisdiction for the betterment of the community. Tom's voice dripped with sarcasm. When I asked how that was possible, she told me to file a formal complaint if I wasn't happy. Emily's eyes widened. "She can't do that, can she?" Tom shook his head. "Not legally, no, but it looks like she's hoping I'll just roll over and let it slide." The following morning, Tom awoke to the sound of hammers and voices. He rushed outside, still in his pajamas, to find two workers installing a bench and a trash bin right next to the sign. His jaw dropped. "What the hell is going on here?" Tom demanded, storming toward the workers. One of them, a young man in a fluorescent vest, glanced up. "HOA orders, sir. Just following instructions." "This is private property," Tom snapped. The worker shrugged, clearly disinterested in the dispute. "Take it up with the HOA." Tom's fists clenched at his sides as he watched them finish their work. By the time they left, the once pristine edge of his lawn was marred by the intrusions. To make matters worse, later that afternoon, people from the neighborhood began wandering onto his property. A family with 2 kids set up a picnic near the bench, their laughter mingling with the sound of crinkling snack wrappers. A man with a golden retriever let his dog sniff around Tom's garden, the animal's paws trampling freshly planted flowers. One woman waved at Tom as he stood frozen in his doorway. "Lovely spot you have here," she called cheerfully. Tom stepped forward, his voice firm but polite. "Excuse me, but this is private property." The woman gestured toward the sign. "Not anymore. The HOA says it's public now." Her nonchalant tone sent a surge of anger through Tom. How could these people think it was acceptable to claim someone else's land just because a sign said so? That evening, Tom sat at the dining table, staring at the property deed spread out before him. Every line confirmed what he already knew. The land was his. It always had been. The HOA had no legal claim to it. And yet Karen Roberts acted as if she had the authority of a king dividing up her kingdom. The next morning, Tom called Karen directly, determined to put an end to the madness. She answered with her usual air of superiority. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "How can I help you?" "You can start by removing that sign and everything else you've installed on my property," Tom said. Karen sighed dramatically. "Mr. Wilson, I've already explained this. The HOA voted to include your property in our jurisdiction. It's for the community's benefit." "You can't just decide that without my consent," Tom shot back. "Actually, we can. It was approved by a majority vote at our last meeting." Karen said smugly, "If you have concerns, you're welcome to attend the next meeting and voice them." Tom gritted his teeth. "This is illegal, and you know it. I have the deed to prove it." Karen's tone shifted, becoming icier. "Then I suggest you take it up with our legal team. Good day, Mr. Wilson." The line went dead, leaving Tom fuming. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to back down without a fight. As he paced the living room, Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "What are you going to do?" Tom's eyes hardened with resolve. "I'm going to fight this. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. This is our home, and no one is going to take it from us." That night, Tom began researching property laws and HOA regulations. He reached out to a local attorney, gathering the first pieces of what would become a case against the HOA. Karen Roberts might think she could bully him into submission, but she was about to learn a hard lesson. You don't mess with someone's home and expect them to roll over. This expanded chapter delves deeply into Tom's emotional turmoil, his growing frustration, and the audacity of Karen's actions. It paints a vivid picture of his peaceful life being upended and sets the stage for a dramatic showdown. Every detail is designed to draw the reader in, making them feel Tom's anger and determination as if it were their own. Who wouldn't root for him to take on the HOA and reclaim his rightful peace? Tom's initial anger was slowly morphing into cold, calculated resolve. He wasn't just upset anymore. He was determined to set things right. But as he soon realized, taking on the HOA, particularly with Karen Roberts at the helm, wasn't going to be a straightforward battle. The next morning, Tom made an appointment with a local real estate attorney, Melissa Grant. Melissa had a reputation for being sharp, relentless, and well-versed in property disputes. When Tom walked into her office, armed with his property deed and a detailed account of the events so far, Melissa listened intently, occasionally nodding and jotting down notes. When Tom finished, Melissa leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Let me get this straight. They installed signs, benches, and trash bins on your property without your consent, then claimed it's now part of their jurisdiction." Tom nodded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Exactly, and Karen, the HOA president, claims they voted on it, but I was never informed, and my property was never part of the HOA to begin with." Melissa smirked, her eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and determination. "Well, Tom, I hate to break it to them, but no vote gives them the right to annex private property. They've overstepped their bounds big time. The question is, how far are you willing to take this?" Tom didn't hesitate. "As far as it takes. This isn't just about my land. It's about standing up to people like Karen who think they can bully others." Melissa's smirk widened. "Good. Then let's start by gathering evidence." Over the next few days, Tom worked tirelessly. He combed through county records to ensure his deed was up to date and unchallenged. He scoured the neighborhood speaking to other homeowners who had grievances with the HOA. To his surprise, he wasn't alone. Several residents shared stories of Karen's overreach, from unjust fines to arbitrary rule changes. One neighbor, Mr. Harris, an elderly widower, recounted how Karen had fined him for having unapproved plants in his garden. "They said my roses were a violation of the aesthetic guidelines," Mr. Harris said, shaking his head. "I didn't even know we had guidelines, but I couldn't afford to fight them, so I just gave in." Hearing these stories only fueled Tom's determination. But as he dug deeper, he realized just how far Karen was willing to go to maintain her grip on the neighborhood. One evening, as Tom was reviewing his findings, Emily walked into the study holding a letter. "This came in the mail today," she said, her voice tight with worry. Tom took the envelope and tore it open. His eyes scanned the contents, and his jaw tightened. The HOA had sent an official notice claiming he owed $2,000 in fines for failure to maintain public property. "This is insane," Tom muttered, his grip on the letter tightening. "They're trying to intimidate us." Emily sat down beside him, her brow furrowed. "What are we going to do? Can they actually enforce this?" Tom exhaled sharply. "Not legally, but they're banking on the fact that most people don't know that. They think I'll fold under the pressure." Later that night, Tom sat in his backyard, staring at the trash bin and bench that now felt like symbols of his struggle. The stars overhead provided a faint sense of calm, but his mind was racing. He couldn't let Karen and the HOA win. The next day, Melissa called with an update. "Tom, I've been reviewing their bylaws and the minutes from their recent meetings. First off, your property isn't listed in their jurisdiction anywhere. Secondly, that vote Karen mentioned, it never happened. She made it up." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "That doesn't surprise me." Melissa's tone turned serious. "But here's where it gets interesting. I've found evidence that Karen's been diverting HOA funds for unauthorized projects, including the installation of that bench and trash bin on your property. If we can prove misuse of funds, we'll have a solid case." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "So, she's not just overstepping, she's committing fraud?" "Exactly," Melissa replied. "And that's something courts take very seriously." With Melissa's guidance, Tom began compiling a comprehensive case. He documented every interaction with the HOA, photographed the installations on his property, and even installed a security camera to capture footage of people using his backyard as a public space. Despite his growing momentum, the fight was taking a toll. Tom noticed the sideways glances from some of his neighbors, whispers that stopped abruptly when he walked by. One morning, as he was retrieving his mail, a woman from down the street approached him. "You know, Tom, she began hesitantly, "some of us appreciate what the HOA does. Karen's a bit intense, but she's kept the neighborhood in order." Tom clenched his teeth but kept his tone measured. "I don't have a problem with the HOA maintaining the neighborhood. I have a problem with them taking what isn't theirs." The woman nodded uncertainly, but didn't press further. That evening, Emily voiced her concerns. "Tom, I'm with you on this, but do you ever feel like we're fighting an uphill battle? What if this gets worse?" Tom took her hand, his expression resolute. "I know it's hard, but if we back down now, Karen will just keep doing this to other people. We have to see this through." The following week brought an unexpected development. As Tom returned home one evening, he found a small group of neighbors gathered on his lawn, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. One of them, a middle-aged man named Steve, stepped forward. "Tom, we've been talking, and we want you to know we support you. Karen's been overstepping for years, but no one's had the guts to stand up to her until now." Tom felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. It means a lot to know I'm not alone in this." Steve nodded. "We've started a petition to demand her resignation as HOA president. With your case, I think we might finally have enough leverage to make a change." The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Tom felt hope. The pieces were falling into place, and Karen's house of cards was beginning to wobble. This chapter captures the escalating tension and stakes of Tom's fight against the HOA. The emotional strain, Karen's manipulative tactics, and the budding support from neighbors add depth to the narrative, setting the stage for a dramatic showdown. Tom's battle with Karen and the HOA was reaching its boiling point. The petition initiated by his neighbors had gained traction, with more and more residents stepping forward to share their own grievances. Stories of Karen's overreach, unjust fines, and questionable decisions flooded in, painting a picture of a leader who thrived on control and intimidation. Yet, even as the tide seemed to turn in his favor, Karen was far from backing down. One morning, Tom woke to find an official-looking envelope taped to his front door. It was marked "Urgent" in bold red letters. He tore it open and scanned the contents. The HOA had filed a lawsuit against him, claiming he was obstructing community development and creating a hostile environment for residents. "This is ridiculous," Tom growled, pacing the kitchen as Emily read over the document. "They're trying to intimidate you," Emily said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "They think if they drag you into court, you'll cave." Tom clenched his fists. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Melissa, his attorney, was equally unimpressed when she reviewed the lawsuit. "This is a classic SLAPP suit. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're trying to silence you through legal intimidation, but the good news is we can use this against them. If we prove this suit is baseless, we can countersue for damages." Tom nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Let's do it." Melissa began building their countersuit, focusing on 3 key points. 1. Fraudulent jurisdiction claims. Karen had no legal grounds to declare Tom's property part of the HOA. 2. Misuse of funds. The installations on Tom's property were unauthorized and paid for using HOA resources. 3. Harassment and intimidation. The fines and lawsuit were clear attempts to bully Tom into compliance. As the court date approached, Tom's days were consumed with preparations. He rehearsed his testimony, gathered witness statements, and reviewed every piece of evidence with Melissa. The support from his neighbors was invaluable. Steve, the man who had started the petition, even offered to testify on Tom's behalf, detailing how Karen had manipulated HOA meetings and silenced dissent. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, her expression cold and composed. She wore a pristine navy suit, as if to project authority and control. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes as she glanced toward Tom's side of the room, where Melissa was setting up a stack of meticulously organized files. Tom took a deep breath as the judge entered and called the session to order. Karen's attorney was the first to speak, painting Tom as a disruptive neighbor who refused to cooperate with the community. Mr. Wilson has consistently obstructed efforts to improve the neighborhood, creating unnecessary conflict and refusing to abide by HOA regulations, the lawyer said, his tone clipped and professional. Melissa was ready. When it was her turn, she laid out their case with precision. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Wilson, is not part of the HOA and never has been. The plaintiff's claims are not only baseless, but also fraudulent. The installations on Mr. Wilson's property were done without his consent, and we have evidence to prove that these actions were not approved by the HOA's membership as required by their bylaws. She then presented the county records confirming that Tom's property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The judge examined the documents, his brow furrowing. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The turning point came when Melissa presented evidence of Karen's misuse of funds. Financial statements showed irregularities, including large, unexplained withdrawals labeled as community projects. Witnesses, including Steve and Mr. Harris, testified about Karen's unilateral decisions and retaliatory tactics against those who questioned her authority. Finally, it was Tom's turn to speak. He stood, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I've spent years building a life for my family on this property. It's not just land, it's our home. For someone to come in without permission and claim it as their own is not only wrong, but deeply personal. This isn't just about me. It's about standing up to people who think they can take what isn't theirs simply because they hold a position of power. As Tom sat down, the judge turned to Karen. Ms. Roberts, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Karen hesitated, her composed demeanor cracking. I was acting in the best interest of the community, she stammered. The judge's expression was stern. Ms. Roberts, the evidence suggests otherwise. Your actions were not only unauthorized but also fraudulent. This court takes such matters very seriously. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled decisively in Tom's favor. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed, and Karen was found personally liable for the misuse of funds. The court ordered the removal of all installations from Tom's property and awarded him compensation for damages and legal fees. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session, Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He glanced at Emily, who smiled through tears of relief. Outside the courthouse, a small group of neighbors gathered to congratulate him. Steve clapped him on the back. You did it, Tom. You stood up to her, and you won. But the victory was about more than just reclaiming his property. It was a message to Karen and anyone like her. Power doesn't trump justice. Tom's fight had inspired others to speak out, and Karen's days as HOA president were numbered. This chapter highlights the pivotal courtroom battle, packed with tension, emotional stakes, and the ultimate triumph of justice. It marks the moment when the tides fully turn in Tom's favor, setting the stage for the resolution. The courtroom victory was a monumental moment for Tom, but the battle's effects reverberated far beyond the judge's ruling. For the first time in months, Tom felt a sense of peace as he returned home, knowing his family's sanctuary was safe. The bench and trash bin that had marred his property were gone within days, hauled away under the watchful eye of Melissa and an enforcement officer. The sign, the very symbol of Karen's audacity, was pulled out of the ground and discarded like the lie it represented. Tom stood on his lawn that morning, watching the workers finish their job. Emily came outside with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him and wrapped her arm around his. "It feels like we can finally breathe again," she said, her voice filled with relief. Tom nodded, his gaze sweeping over the restored landscape. "We stood our ground, and we won. It's over." But it wasn't quite over, not yet. The aftermath of the case sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Karen's downfall was the talk of the community, her once unshakable authority now reduced to whispered scorn. The petition Steve had started gained even more signatures after the trial, with residents demanding her resignation as HOA president. Within 2 weeks, Karen stepped down, her reign of intimidation and manipulation brought to an unceremonious end. Her resignation wasn't voluntary. During the court proceedings, financial discrepancies revealed a pattern of misuse stretching back years. Karen had diverted HOA funds for personal projects, including the installation of a private deck in her backyard and upgrades to her home that were falsely labeled as community improvements. A formal investigation was launched, and Karen faced additional lawsuits from homeowners seeking reparations. For many residents, Karen's removal felt like the dawn of a new era. The HOA, once a source of fear and resentment, began to restructure under new leadership. A younger, more transparent president, Rachel Sanders, was elected. Rachel reached out to Tom directly, extending an olive branch. "Mr. Wilson," she said during their first meeting, "I can't change the past, but I want to assure you that this HOA will never again overstep its bounds. Your case has reminded us all of the importance of respecting our neighbors." Tom appreciated her sincerity, though he remained wary of the organization. "I hope you stick to that promise," he replied. Meanwhile, Tom and Emily's neighbors began to view them in a new light. Those who had once hesitated to take a stand against Karen now saw Tom as a symbol of resilience. Mr. Harris, the elderly widower who had been unfairly fined for his roses, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of homegrown tomatoes. "These are for you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." Tom accepted the gift with a humble smile. "I just did what anyone would do to protect their home." But the most surprising outcome came in the form of a monthly check. As part of the court's ruling, the HOA was ordered to pay Tom $2,000 in damages for the unauthorized use of his property. For the Wilson family, the money was less about financial gain and more about the symbolic victory. Each check that arrived in the mail was a reminder that they had stood up against injustice and won. Emily joked about framing the first one. "It's like a trophy," she said with a laugh. Tom smirked. "A very expensive trophy." The fight also brought changes within the Wilson family. Tom's determination to protect their home left a lasting impression on his children. Lily, his eldest, who had once been too young to understand the nuances of the conflict, now spoke with pride about her dad. "You didn't let them push you around," she said one evening at dinner. "That's pretty cool." Tom chuckled, but her words warmed his heart. For Emily, the ordeal reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with Tom in the first place. His unwavering sense of right and wrong. They spent more time together in the months that followed, enjoying the tranquility of their backyard without the looming threat of trespassers or unwanted sign. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. The once divided community began to heal, united by their shared experience of standing up to Karen's tyranny. Tom remained vigilant, keeping an eye on HOA activities and staying involved in local meetings. His story inspired others to be more proactive in protecting their rights, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond their little corner of suburbia. One afternoon, as Tom was tending to his garden, Steve stopped by with some good news. "Did you hear?" Steve asked, a grin spreading across his face. "Hear what?" Tom replied, wiping dirt from his hands. "Karen sold her house. She's leaving the neighborhood." Tom paused, processing the news. "Is that so?" Steve nodded. "Couldn't handle the fallout, I guess. People stopped trusting her, and after the lawsuits started piling up, well, I think she figured it was time to move on." Tom didn't celebrate her departure, but he felt a quiet sense of closure. Karen's actions had brought chaos to his life, but now, with her gone, the chapter felt truly closed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom and Emily sat on their patio, watching Lily and Ben chase each other across the yard. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, its branches catching the golden light. "We made it through," Emily said softly, resting her head on Tom's shoulder. Tom wrapped an arm around her, his gaze steady. "Yeah, we did. And if it ever happens again—" He trailed off, but Emily finished the thought for him. "They'll know better than to mess with the Wilsons." They shared a laugh, the kind born from shared struggles and hard-won victories. For the first time in months, life felt normal again, peaceful, just as it was meant to be. This final chapter brings the story full circle, showing the long-term impact of Tom's victory. It celebrates not only his resilience, but also the ripple effects of standing up for what's right. The Wilsons' home is restored, justice is served, and the community begins to heal, all thanks to one man's refusal to back down.